So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Sinead Younge as our speaker today. Dr. Younge is the Danforth Endowed Professor of Psychology at Morehouse College. Dr. Younge is an ecological community psychologist who conducts public health research and investigates the social conditions surrounding disease transmission. She has spent the past 2 decades examining the socio-political context of HIV/AIDS and other chronic conditions globally. Dr. Younge is a Georgia transplant and enjoys learning about her adopted state's history. So Dr. Younge, Sinead, I will turn it over to you. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. And even though I'm not physically at the DeKalb History Center, it is really one of my favorite places. So I thank you all for having me. And as Jennifer mentioned, I am a Georgia transplant, but Georgia is the place where I've lived the longest. So it feels like home to me. And Decatur is the place that I've lived the longest. So it's my adopted home, and I just love it. So I want this to be a little bit of a discussion in addition to the presentation. And so could not get the poll to work, but I just want you guys to think about some of these questions that I ask you. And one of the first questions is kind of in this time period where we are right now, I want you to think about where is it that you get most of your information? And that could be information about COVID, it could be information about current events. And so some of your responses may, and if you would like to use the chat box, you're welcome to, but is it newspapers? Is it social media? Is it from attending public lectures like this? Is it from speaking with friends? But think about where is it that you get most of your information from? And so as Jennifer mentioned, I am a psychologist, but I'm a researcher. I'm not a clinician. And I have studied HIV/AIDS for the past 2 decades. And I might even say for the past 3 decades, because my mother is a retired nurse. I grew up in California, and we actually moved to California from England early 80s at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And she was a home nurse, and at that time that was relatively new. And so this is when the technology was just catching up, and we were able to do intravenous lines in homes. And so most of her patients were some of the early HIV/AIDS patients, and many of them were the movie stars in Hollywood, the actors and the actresses and various people. So because she was a home healthcare nurse, and she had this kid with her, she would often have to take me with her. And so it made me just an observer of the world and what was going on. And so I think for many of us who remember the 80s and the 90s, you can't think about that time period without thinking about all of the social conditions that were also going on. And so as a psychologist, I study human behavior. And behavior occurs, within this larger context. It doesn't really occur in a bubble. And I kind of laugh when I say that right now, because we are in COVID, and many of us have been social distancing and practicing good public health since March. So many of us do feel like we're in a bubble. But the bubble is permeable, and we're getting information in these various sources that I talked about. And so all health conditions do occur within a context, and COVID is no different. We also happen to be in the middle of an election year. Feels like years. And so, I think often about in 100 years, what are we going to remember most about this time period? None of us will be around, but, we are all leaving memories, and we're all documenting in our own way. And, now with the advent of the cell phone, we're carrying around these cameras and these videos. And of course, it's going to look very different 100 years from now. But, if we can make a time capsule of 2020 and someone open it up you know, 100 years from now, and actually could figure out the technology and how to look at our videos and maybe look at our text messages and social media. You know, there's a whole context around what was happening that would need to be explained. So I think about, how are those historians, how are those archivists actually going to explain all that was going on? Yeah, it's puzzling to me, and I don't know the answers. So I wish I could be around to see it. I have a couple of slides, and we are going to have some time for some discussion. I'm going to try to do my best with multitasking and monitoring the chat box, and let's see how I do with that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Give me just a moment to get them set up. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So originally my presentation was documenting the intersections of the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and social injustice. And this was a title from a couple of weeks ago, but you know, we could actually say it's no longer the twin pandemics. We could say it's like a septuplet pandemics and of what's going on, because there's so much. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen this summer lots of protests and lots of marches for social justice. We've seen what's happening with the fires in the West and the hurricanes out this way. So there's just, you know, all of these things, in addition to it being an election year and just everything else going on. And, you know, I think this is where I take a moment, particularly as a psychologist, to say that we are all experiencing things, and it's kind of trite at this point to say it, but it's worth saying, that we've never experienced in combination. So in some ways, and I do this myself, it's almost like we're experiencing a collective trauma. Because maybe you've lived places where there's been epidemics, maybe you've lived places where there's been natural disasters, there's always been contentious elections, but you know, very few amongst us have experienced all of these things at once. And it does have an impact on us, it really does. So, you know, I have a couple of polls. So I love looking at the Gallup polls and looking at how people's attitudes towards things have changed over the years. And this one just goes back to '85. But you know, it's a poll that asks about with which one of these statements do you most agree? Protection of the environment should be given priority, even at the risk of curbing economic growth, or economic growth should be given priority even if the environment suffers to some extent. As you can see from the poll, you know, it's been mixed over the years. So in '85, it was protection of the environment, and then it kind of dips down in 2003, and people were really worried about economic growth. And, you know, we all remember what happened in 2008. And so I use these graphs just to show that attitudes change, and they largely change just because of awareness. So we become more informed. So we weren't talking a lot about global warming 30 years ago. We were talking about the environment, but the science had to catch up to inform us of what was going on. And that informed our policy and our views about things. And of course, when you are in a place where there's economic downturns, that becomes even more of a priority. So all that's happening, you know, it's dynamic. We live in a dynamic world that's heavily impacted by day-to-day issues. And so, you know, I always, I teach mostly Generation Z at this point, and it's fascinating because, you know, for me, they get younger and younger as I get older and older, and their views about things are fascinating. And so if you ask them about LGBTQ issues, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer issues, you know, they'll say, oh, you know, we still have a long way to go, but we fought and we gained a lot of rights very quickly. And, you know, they forget that this was a long road of gaining legal rights for same-sex couples. And again, this graph starts at 87, but we could go much, much further back in thinking about rights for LGBTQ individuals. And so, again, this graph just shows individuals' opinions about do you think gay or lesbian relations between consenting adults should or should not be legal? This lighter green line is it should be legal. This darker green is that it should not. And so you kind of see where we are today in 2020. And again, polls, you know, as we all know at this point, polls are only as good as the people that you are actually polling. And so Gallup does a pretty good job of getting a pretty representative sample. But it is just that, it's a sample. So it's, you know, some of us could look at these polls and say, this does not reflect the group of people that I hang out with. But this is more of a national average. I think I just have one more poll to show you. Two more maybe. So right now, one of the hot button issues going on is pro-choice and the right for legal abortion. So do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances, or legal only under certain circumstances, or illegal in all circumstances? And so again, what you're seeing here is this dark green line is people saying, the percentage of people saying that it should be legal only under certain circumstances. This lighter green line is legal under any circumstances, and then the gray line, illegal in all circumstances. And again, these attitudes are going to be impacted by which part of the country you're in, which group of individuals, and so it's just a snapshot. Last one, I promise. This was a poll about race relations in this country. And so the question asked, please tell me if you personally worry about race relations, a great deal, a fair amount, only a little, or not at all. And so this is the percentage of people who said that they worry a great deal. And so again, this does not go to 2020, but you know, if we're talking about something like the Black Lives Matter movement, it really got its start about 5 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago. And so again, this poll is going to be largely dependent upon who you're asking these questions of. And I bring these things up just to say that we are at a time, I mean, a lot of us love history, we love learning about history. And even if you're not a history lover, you are aware that you could see shifts retrospectively. So you can see over the years how people's attitudes towards something like HIV has evolved over the years. But we're in a time right now where we're seeing people's attitudes shift so quickly about a number of different things. And it's almost like our heads are just pivoting. And so, I think that when I talk about social justice, and I'll give a definition just in a moment, I'm really using it as an umbrella term. And again, this is a poll from the Pew Research Center. It's asking Americans, well, Americans have mixed views of the long-term effects of increased focus on racial injustice. And this is the percentage of people saying the increased focus on issues of race and racial inequality in our country in the past 3 months. This poll was taken in September. And so about 34% said that there'll be a major change, 42% said a minor change. I believe that's 22% saying no change. You know, and it's interesting to me because if people were to ask me about racial justice and racial inequality, 3 months is not my marker. And it's not because I'm a Black woman living in the US, but I have just been aware of these issues from as long as I can remember. So it's really interesting, the markers that we use, but again, it's a poll. I'm gonna come back to this slide. So what again, in the title of this presentation, it's talking about the twin pandemics of COVID and social injustice. But I want to talk about what social justice is. And, most of us will remember from our high school philosophy classes or sections, or if you took it in college, just this term about justice and the greater good. But Oxford, couple of other dictionaries and human rights organizations just very plainly define it as justice is in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. It's the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. And again, this is the US. We are an experiment, and we were founded on this idea that you come here and you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and you get to determine what your destiny is. But those of us who are students, even novice students of history, know that it's not as cut and dry as that. The story is a little bit more complicated. And so if you haven't already, I would strongly recommend that everyone Google, and if I have time, I'll put it in the chat box a little bit later, but the Executive Order on Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. Some of you may have heard about this, but this was an executive order that was put out just a few weeks ago by the president. And it talks a lot about anti-American sentiment and stereotyping, and this notion that certain groups, men, white men in particular, have been scapegoated and have been just this idea that history, we've not been patriotic when we talk about racism, when we talk about sexism, when we talk about ableism. And so this executive order has had ripple effects. A lot of my friends who are consultants or work for federal entities, they've done trainings on diversity and inclusion and equity. And this executive order has essentially put a stop to that. And so again, if you have time, I really recommend that you look through it. But the reason I wanted just to touch on it briefly is that this, I think, is a really great example of how we're interpreting history, right? Because I think there's this notion that facts are facts. But I think all of us who are alive in this day and age and look at multiple sources of information, I think we understand that there's not necessarily a shared understanding on facts. And so again, if we think about 100 years from now, maybe a year from now, how are we going to interpret some of this information? How are we going to tell these stories? I joke because I have two older sisters, and we will tell stories about our childhood that are vastly different. Could be the same scenario, could be the same thing that has happened, but vastly different. And that's human nature. That is human nature, right? Do look at that executive order when you get a chance. All right, so we're at a time where most of us, if not all of us, have heard about Black Lives Matter. And, it evokes, just the name, just these three words really evokes different feelings for people. For some people, and I'll speak for myself, and I'll speak for people who I went to high school with, they feel that it's an organization, it is one organization, and that stands for different things. And so there's not really a shared understanding of what it is. And so I often encourage people to go on their website and take a look and see. And, one of the things that it says on the website is that it is not a centralized organization. And I think this is very confusing for people because it is a rallying slogan that so many people have chanted. So there's this idea that, okay, well, and there's also a list of recommendations that Black Lives Matter has. So how can you have recommendations and not be a centralized organization with leadership? How come we can't look to one person as the leader? And so it really flies in the face of what we know about organizing and protest from the past. But as I said, times are changing. And if the one thing I've learned from my students is what applied yesteryear doesn't necessarily apply today. And so this was actually a photograph that I took this past weekend in Decatur, and I have a few more photos that I'll show you. This was earlier in the summer. This was a Black Lives Matter protest, and this was in the square again. I believe it was organized locally, and it's intentionally blurry, but I think one of the things to note here is that it's incredibly diverse. And I think if you think back to the protests of the 60s, they were, if you think about the Washington protests specifically, pretty diverse. But, I think even now, civil rights leaders will say that these movements today are much more diverse. So there's something going on. And I tried pulling it up before I came on and I couldn't find it. But there's a researcher who talks about how the pandemic really has impacted how people have viewed what's going on currently. And she speculates that because a lot of us have had a lot of time at home and reflecting on what's going on and digesting different pieces of information, it's just impacted these protests in a very different way. And it's not just in the US, it's globally. It's globally. So we see protests happening all over the world, including Nigeria right now. So I went to school. I've grown up in the US. I did the early part of my schooling in England where I was born. But, when I came to the US, I learned in 1492, I think you guys could finish the rest. Columbus sailed the ocean blue and have always celebrated Columbus Day. And then I got to college, and I went to college in San Diego. And there's a pretty large or sizable Indigenous population that live in San Diego. And I started learning a little bit more about the First Nations people. And there was a movement even back then. So this is 20 years ago to recognize kind of the history of what happened and that Columbus never set foot in the United States, right? And so there was a gathering, a protest this past weekend, actually Sunday, at the Decatur Square at the courthouse, and it was really around this cannon. And this was organized by Beacon Hill and largely by the students of Beacon Hill. And it talked a lot about the history of this area that we're on, which was the land of the Muskogee Creek Nations. And it during the protest, and this is a little bit of a history that I had learned myself, it talked about the Trail of Tears, and it just talked about this history that I didn't learn a whole lot of when I was in K through 12. And so this cannon, which was erected in 1906, I believe, or donated in 1906, erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy, I believe, is a symbol. And it's a symbol, and there was an individual who was from the Muskogee Creek Nation who talked about the Trail of Tears and his ancestors walking to the Dakotas and having cannons behind them the whole way. And so there is a petition by Beacon Hill to remove this cannon, and we're going to talk a little bit, we'll have time, about the removal of monuments and what they mean. But I just thought this was interesting, and again, it's how are we remembering history and how are we documenting it? That's the big question. And so this, this is a term that we've all heard. It's not a new term though. This term, it sounds familiar, but this is actually a term that's been in existence for quite some time. But this is what we're hearing a lot of now. And I as a psychologist, and again, someone who studies behavior, what I do know is this: it is hard to get people to change their minds just simply by giving them information. And I think any one of us who's ever had a prescription for antibiotics, and maybe there's a few of you who are really good, many of us, myself included, may not have taken the full prescription. Maybe you start feeling better on day 4 and say, I don't need those extra pills. But you know that you should take them. You know that you should take them. But I say this as an example of our logical mind, or what we call executive thinking. Our frontal lobe has to compete with the emotional part of us. So we feel good. So, it doesn't matter, if they say we should take 2 extra days of antibiotics. I know better than those doctors or those pharmacists. So we're in a time where and one of the poll questions I had was, do you agree, or do you get into disagreements with people in your immediate social circle? And again, you can kind of, you're welcome to use the hand if you're able to. On Zoom, there's something where you can raise your hand or give a thumbs up. And by your social circle, I mean, it could be family members, it could be the people just immediately around you. And so for me, in 2016, I will admit, I believe I lived in a echo chamber, because everyone around me agreed and thought, or at least they seemed to agree and think like I thought, and and I wasn't hearing divergent views. And I said, well, something's wrong with this, because not everyone should be agreeing with me. I know not everyone thinks like I do. I've had a very different life experience than most people. So what's going on? So I feel like ever since then, I've really made a concerted effort to try to widen my social net, my social circle, and really have conversations with people who don't think like me and who disagree with me, because I really love hearing the other perspective. And it's not necessarily to argue with it, but I just want to know, like, if you're for something that I'm not for, well, just tell me about it, because it's really interesting to me. And it's not just an academic exercise, but I think it just makes me grow as a person, right? Mm-hmm. So, I hearken back to, if we're talking about COVID, there's been a million comparisons with the Spanish flu or the Spanish influenza of 1918 and 1919. For those of us who've done a little bit of research on it, we know that it lasted a long time. I think, it's documented as 2 years, but it really lasted a bit longer than that. Its main impact was over a 2-year period, killed many, many people. But if you look back at the old reports, there's so many parallels between what was happening then and what's happening now. It's almost scary, because science has evolved so much since then. But what people forget is that viruses are brilliant. They're smart, they adapt, they evolve. And so science has to keep evolving as well. Mm. So, these are just a couple of photographs. Some of you have seen. The New York Times has done a great job documenting some of these old photographs from the Spanish influenza. And so these are individuals lined up in San Francisco in 1918. And, I think about, I've known about the Spanish flu, but I don't think I focused on it a lot. And I teach health courses, so it's really interesting. In the past, there may have been a blurb about it. But if I think about this time period, I think about the suffragist movement more, and women fighting for the right to vote. And so, this is a bit blurry, but you have a picture here of women in front of the White House marching, and they don't have masks on. But the flu was still raging at that time period. you also had anti-maskers back then. So, a friend of mine, when I was telling her about this, she said, well, why were people not wearing masks? And it's similar reasons why people don't want to wear masks now. People feel like it is an infringement upon their rights. And so, again, there were meetings, there were fines that were given back in 1918, 1919, if people did not wear a mask. And on this picture from July 2020, you have individuals who feel that very similarly. So not much has changed in 20 years. One thing I think about also during this time period is, well, what was the racial dynamic like? And so we know that, the early part of the last century was fraught with lots of social unrest. And we also know that there were a number of lynchings that were occurring at this time period. And so, in my naive mind, I sometimes think, okay, global pandemic going on, Spanish influenza, maybe people aren't going to be so focused on treating one another poorly. Well, that's not the case. And so I'm going to show this, and if anyone wants my slides, and I'm happy to give more information. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but this is the story of Mary Turner, who some of you may have heard about in the past. She was lynched in May of 1918. The epidemic really began hitting in March of that year. She was 21 years old and she was pregnant, and she was lynched for speaking out against the lynching of her own husband. And so this was down in Valdosta. And so it made me think, gosh, people weren't even pausing to focus on the epidemic. But, again, lots of similarities with what happened back then and what's happening now as well. This was just placed in front of the courthouse this year. And for those who are not familiar, I know some of you are, with the Equal Justice Initiative. It's an initiative by Brian Stevens, who built this amazing center in Montgomery to honor the lives of those who were lynched during the time period of 1877 to 1950. And he's asking all of the counties to put up markers and just be able to document what was happening back then. And so I work at Morehouse College, and I have asked my students just to document what's going on. Like, how would they document what's happening right now? And they've sent me some photographs, and so I just wanted to share a few with you all. And so, this is so interesting because people are graduating. And, I think, and I've shared this with Jennifer, it's almost like living in parallel universes, where I have been social distancing since March and going out to the grocery store and visiting with friends in parks and in the backyard. But it's interesting to see how other people are coping, and everyone's tolerance for risk is going to be different. And so this is a group of high school students who are graduating with their masks on. And this is another picture of a student who's at a mosque, and he wrote a little caption, and I'm sorry I didn't include it, but he talks about, a mosque is supposed to be a place that welcomes the community and people can come and worship together. And so here they're socially distancing about 6 feet apart. So, it's just very striking, as opposed to some other pictures of individuals that you've seen worshiping at mosques that are much closer together. These are masks. I know they look like something else, but they're actually masks. And so a student, he captioned it, "The new normal in the upside down." And so this is his collection of masks that he wears when he goes out and after cleaning them. And, I think all of us have kind of a makeshift place where we keep our different masks as well. And so I wanted to kind of wrap up and share a few thoughts with you. Some of you may have seen this picture before. And this is from a protest in Birmingham. And this is a young man, and his name is escaping me, but this is a young man who was in school at the time. He was a high school student. I believe he was about 16 years old. And he heard that Martin Luther King was coming to Birmingham to lead a protest. And he went to this protest, and this dog, this gentleman, this police officer was there with a dog. And so I actually, if you all are comfortable, I would like to have you unmute yourselves. And just, if you haven't seen this picture already, and again, we are recording, so if you're comfortable, if a couple of you just want to share just a couple of perspectives from this picture, like what do you see?
I see the dog biting that young man.
Yeah. Anything else? There's no wrong answer, by the way.
The name of the restaurant's Jockey Boy.
Yeah. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, it's offensive to me. The lawn jockey is what that brings to mind. I mean, you know, it was a different time period, but that just struck me right away.
Well, and the police officer is basically holding the guy by the sweater to make sure the dog can get a good grip on him. This incident is actually memorialized in the park in Birmingham, near where these protests were taking place, in a statue that's pretty terrifying.
I think the other thing that I see, sadly, is that those that are there, it is a matter of fact look on their faces.
Yes.
It's a common, you know, it's just, for them, it's commonplace, no surprise, particularly the gentleman directly to the right in the suit and hat. It's just kind of another day on the block at 6th Avenue. Sad to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's hard to know whether they moved forward to help protect him or whether they stayed where they were while this was happening and let it continue unstopped. So unless without a video, you can't really ascertain whether they came to his defense, which I would doubt. I suspected they would be afraid.
I was going to say, if I was a betting man,
Yeah,
I'd say not.
yeah, probably fearful.
And even the expression on the man's face who's being attacked, I mean, I know it's just a second of time, but he seems so calm and resigned, you know, not horrified.
Yeah.
Very impactful.
Yeah. I'm going to show you another. Thank you, everyone. It's really, you guys are all A students. I didn't catch the name, but someone mentioned this is the statue, the sculpture that was put in the nearby park about this. And I apologize, that's a little cut off. But, you know, it's terrifying, you know, and it's moving at the same time, and it evokes great emotion, right? And so I want to actually show you the two images side by side. What do you all notice about those differences?
Well, the dog looks more ferocious, and the young man looks much more frightened.
And there's a physical distance between the police officer and the young man statue, as opposed to in the photograph where he seems much closer together. They seem much closer together physically.
And I would say to you that, so while the statue's exaggerated from the photograph, I think that the purpose of this statute exemplifies the position of authority from the position of the police officer at arm's length to the victim, the black man. I think that there is some, if you were a poet, you would see some symmetry to what that would represent in an authoritative yet standoffish effect. Just my impression.
Absolutely.
The statue also captures terror, which the other one doesn't.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Was someone else going to say something?
No.
So I want to point you guys to, if you listen to podcasts, Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast. Some of you may be familiar, Revisionist History. And I will put a link before I get off the Zoom.
Good.
And he has an episode called The Foot Soldier of Birmingham. It's season 2, episode 4, where he goes into detail about the statue. I've seen this picture. I've seen the picture in a textbook that I use in my classes. And in the textbook, it talks about the young man who grew up with dogs. And you can't really see it again. And, you know, this is so much of a metaphor for history, right? We have a snapshot of time and we're all left to interpret what's going on. And we don't have the other snapshots that preceded it or that came after it. And we don't have the video, so we don't know what people sounded like. We don't know if there was a hush over the crowd or if people were yelling. But this young man, it's very slight. He has his knee up. So he grew up with dogs and he knew to raise his knee to kind of, to get the dog away from him. And again, because we don't have the audio, the officer is actually saying, whoa, and he's holding the dog. You could see that the leash is held pretty taut, right? And in Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, he does such a beautiful job because the gentleman in the picture is actually interviewed years later in the 90s. And he said, the interviewer said, how does it feel to be immortalized in this statue? And he said, I don't really like that statue. And so the interviewer says, well, why? And he says, well, it is not accurate. And so the interviewer says, well, why not? And he says, well, I'm tall. I'm 6'4", or at that time he might have been a little bit taller, but he's 6'4". He said he wasn't scared of the dog. And one of you said it, that he has kind of this calm look on his face. And he, you know, it goes into detail. So I really do want to encourage you to listen to the podcast. But he also talks about the features of the statue not really representing his own features, and that he looks darker, like a darker skinned person in the statue. And he also said, you know, I skipped school to be there, because the interviewer said, well, you know, how did you feel about the civil rights movement? And, you know, what were you doing down there that day as a foot soldier? And the guy says, I wasn't a foot soldier. I was just skipping school. I wanted to see Martin Luther King. So here you have this revered moment in history, you know, and the cool thing about that episode is that they also interview the sculptor. And he is asked to talk about kind of the poetic license that he took. And he says, I wanted to make the dog even more ferocious than he actually appeared in that picture. And I wanted the police officer to be larger. And he said, I even increased the police officer's glasses, the size of his glasses, to make it seem like it's almost like a guide dog. And so, I mean, it's a fascinating episode, but I think it really captures kind of what happens in history and how we retell these stories and reimagine these stories. And I just think it's such a beautiful example. You know, we've talked a lot over these past couple of months about statues toppling. And this is a statue of King George III being toppled. by people in the colonies, you know, trying to gain their independence from England. And, you know, the question I think becomes, what is the significance of statues? You know, there's arguments as to we should remove statues, put them in museums, or put more context around them. But, you know, if we think about it, I think we can all agree that statues are there to send messages. And the question is, well, what is the message that we want to send with the statues? And, you know, I have a good neighbor, we go back and forth a little bit about, you can't just tear down a statue just because you don't like it. And I agree with that. But again, I think there's a whole context around statues that, and how we remember history, and therefore how we document history. And so I leave you with this, and we can open it up for a little bit of discussion. Some of you have heard this proverb before, that until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. And we all have our ways of looking at history, at the present, and documenting it in some way. And it's years from now that, even right now actually, that we're not agreeing on what's happening in the present. So, you know, the question will be, how is it that people will learn about what happened from the past? And so with that, I just want to offer a very warm thank you to the DeKalb History Center for having me. And I want to go ahead and open it up for, you know, let's Q&A or discussion.